Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here with us. We're really excited for tonight's program. I'm Kristen Taylor. I'm the Curator of Academic Programs and Collections at the Museum of Contemporary Photography at Columbia College Chicago. And tonight's lecture by Loretta Ross is being presented in conjunction with our current exhibition titled Reproductive, Health, Fertility, Agency. This exhibition features the work of 8 artists: Carmen Wynant, Krista Franklin, Doreen Garner, Joanne Leonard, Laya Abril, Candy Guinea, Candy Sprites, and Eleanor Carucci. And the exhibition is now on view at the museum until May 23rd, and we are open to the public. So we're really excited. We hope that you can come see the show in Chicago if you're in the area and make a reservation in advance. The exhibition is free. You just have to make a reservation on our website. Please also keep an eye on our website for upcoming programs, including a lecture in photography by Carmen Wynant, a lecture by Candy Sprites, and a panel discussion about destigmatizing reproductive health on March 10th. And next week on February 18th, we even have a teen sex education workshop presented in conjunction with the Chicago Women's Health Center. Reproductive Health Fertility Agency was organized by myself together with Karen Irvine, Chief Curator and Deputy Director of the MOCP.
That's me. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thanks again for being here. As Kristen started to tell you a little bit about the show, I just wanted to give you a little background. It was really important to both Kristen and I to present many aspects of reproductive health from, and many subjects that are still, we feel like, too invisible and taboo in our society, ranging from menstruation to miscarriage to menopause and illness. And we also wanted to provide a really expansive view, an inclusive view of all these subjects, and to also relay a more correct history. So from the fraught history of birth control and the lack of access to abortion, to the challenges faced by the LGBTQ community when they try to become parents, to the injustices that were faced by women of color throughout the history of medicine and gynecology. We really wanted to, address many of these issues. And that's partly why we're so thrilled to have professor and activist Loretta Ross here today with us. Loretta is one of the founders of Sister Song, which is an organization that's been dealing with reproductive justice for a long time. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Asha Imanville, who is our curatorial fellow, who was really instrumental in planning a lot of the programming that Kristen mentioned in her intro, and especially for organizing this lecture tonight with Loretta. So thank you, Asha. Thanks, Loretta, for being here. And Asha, take it away.
Thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here, Professor Ross. And I wanted to have maybe just a quick informal, if I lean in a little bit, can you hear me? I got a new microphone, but it's broken. Okay. It's so interesting to me that your history as an activist spans more than 50 years. And I was reading a statement where you said that your activism began at the age of 16 when you were tear gassed as a first-year student at Howard University, which is something, if I wonder, was happening for a lot of people last summer. And I think it's so remarkable and special to have you here in this time. All that you've given to us and all that you have to share and all that we have to learn has always been so necessary, but again, is incredibly, incredibly necessary now. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I've always thought it was interesting reading your background and keeping up with you over the years, how you've worked in reproductive justice, you've worked in anti-racism and anti-white supremacy. You even were one of the co-leaders of the Women's March in Washington, DC in 2004. I remember being there that day and it was so powerful and I was so proud. And I wonder if before you do the presentation, looking at the history of BIPOC women and reproductive justice and oppression, if you could just share for us a little bit about solidarity amongst communities, something that I think, again, has always been so important, but I wonder if people are missing out a little bit at this present moment.
Well, I actually have a photo from the march in my deck, because I said I was going to look up some historical photos for you. But the photo that probably comes to mind that I don't have in my deck is the one from 2017. What we'll all remember is the Pink Pussy March to protest Trump's inauguration. And there was a lot of debate among women of color whether to participate in that march, because women of color as a whole were understandably outraged that 57% of white women had voted for, you know, the man who said, grab him by the so-and-so, right? And we just didn't understand that. And so the debate among women of color was whether we should go and whether we should participate. And I weighed in on the struggle, not that I was planning on marching myself. I mean, I am too old, too fat, too lazy for that myself, but I wanted to encourage people to go. And I wrote a couple of editorials, but the basic premise I was saying is, yes, 57% of white women voted for Trump, but I bet you the ones organizing the Pink Pussy March were not in that 57%. They were the 43% who didn't. And we need to be strategic as women of color to make sure that we work with the white women who are in resistance to white supremacy rather than scorn them because of their identity while ignoring their politics. And that, I hope, made a difference. And then Alicia Garza, the founder of Black Lives Matter, co-founder, echoed that when she asked whether or not our, calling out will build a movement, but only collaboration will. But that is the most recent photo in my head addressing what you're talking about, because our failure to be ideologically consistent while we trip over the buried wires of identity is not working well. White supremacy is an ideology. Whiteness is just an identity. And so we need to be fighting the ideas, not the people. I don't know if that makes any sense, because you're asking people to change conditions and identities that they have no control over anyway. So even if they wanted to give us everything we want, who can unwhite themselves? That's just isn't possible. And so I also use a framework that contrasts blame versus responsibility, because none of us alive built this system of white supremacy, racialized capitalism that we're dealing with, but we all can play a role in dismantling it. It's just like Isabel Wilkerson said in her book, Caste. He said, imagine that you bought a new house and you moved into it and you found that the plumbing was shoddy. Well, you can sit there fussing about the shoddy plumbing and why the previous homeowner didn't fix it, or you can fix the dang plumbing so you can live in the house. So to end this unfinished civil war that our country is in right now, we're the ones that need to fix the plumbing, even though we're not responsible for the house having shoddy plumbing. So I hope that answers your question.
It does.
I try to be strategic. I try to be targeted. I am writing books and teaching about calling in the calling out culture, which is my favorite topic nowadays. But I want to be targeted and precise in who I call out. And the distinction that I make is the assumption that everyone makes mistakes. We're all human. We make mistakes. So if you make a mistake and you won't admit that you made a mistake, and if you are unwilling to learn from your mistake or unwilling to acknowledge the harm your mistake made or caused, then I'm going to call you out. But if you made a mistake and you admit that you made a mistake and you want to do better and you're going to make sure you don't do it again, then I'm going to call you in. And so it's not about finding perfect people to do work with, because they don't exist anyway. It's not even about finding the perfect ideas to work with, because they also don't exist. But it's about working with adults who have enough self-mastery to own up to their mistakes and do better. That's called adulting. I tailor to 18-year-olds all the time in my classrooms. That really is the only difference. They seem to imagine that if they're going to live a mistake-free life and yet they walk around on emotional eggshells for fear that someone's going to call them out for a mistake. And so they spend a lot of time doing what a boomer like me calls fronting, pretending that they're error-free, pretending that they can't make mistakes, and in deathly fear that they won't fight, they won't run into a gotcha moment. And I'm saying we can do better than that. And so that's been my credo for 50 years, because I'm one of those Black women who didn't come into the human rights movement through the window of civil rights. I came into the movement through women's rights. And I had to actually go back and learn about civil rights much later. And so I've always been a Black feminist from the day in 1970 when they put the autobiography of Malcolm X in one hand and The Black Woman by Toni Cade in my other hand. And so at 16, I cobbled together this identity as a Black feminist who did anti-apartheid work, anti-gentrification work, prison abolition work, even in 1970. And so that's the perspective I bring, because being on the margins of the feminist movement, one of the things I had to learn, particularly when I got the job at NOW, because I started the Women of Color program at NOW, the National Organization for Women, was that at first I spent so much energy trying to get white women to understand the realities of Black women. And then I realized how useless that was, because as I got to know the white women I was working with, I realized they didn't even understand how to be appropriately white. And they live in their skin every day. And so I changed my project. I started teaching about white supremacy within the women's movement and how we can divest ourselves of that, and how to reclaim pride in being white without the ideology of white supremacy. And I think the most stumping question I can ask a white person today, still 30 or 40 years later, is, what makes you proud to be white? And 99% have no answer to that question. Yet 99% of Black people know why we're proud to be Black. And so that's the kind of work I do right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Do you want me to get into my PowerPoint now?
That would be wonderful. We would love to see this collection from Smith College and women's history. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I produced a photo collection because I'm not that person, but I did produce photos, asked them to curate some photos for me so that they could illustrate my talk and presentation on reproductive justice. Is that okay? Because I don't want to make you think that I can do a photo exhibit. Honey, I can't even use a camera, so I am not that person.
Wonderful.
Okay. Can you see that screen?
Yes.
Okay. First thing I have to do is get all your faces out of my way so I can see the screen. Okay, again, thank you for allowing me to come speak to y'all today. I am one of the 12 women who created the concept of reproductive justice, and you may not know that the concept was birthed in Chicago. We were in 1994 attending a conference by the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. And at this conference, a representative of the Clinton administration came and tried to persuade us to embrace Hillary Clinton's proposal for healthcare reform. We're of course talking about the Bill Clinton administration, and Hillary was his legislative manager for that effort. But what they had done as a strategic decision was to omit reproductive health care from healthcare reform. And they thought by doing so that they would lessen Republican opposition to healthcare reform. And as you can imagine, that didn't turn out that well. They still opposed it, the Republicans. But the question for us 12 Black women in Chicago at that time is, why would the Clinton administration sent a healthcare proposal asking for our endorsement that omits reproductive health care when reproductive health care is the main driver of women to the doctor. And so we spliced together the concepts of reproductive rights and social justice and created reproductive justice. So I just want to honor Chicago as the birthplace of reproductive justice, something you probably already didn't know. And we had to make sure that we fought reproductive justice, that we created reproductive justice as a way to fight white supremacy and population control. And so you see some historical photos there. Some of those photos, the one on the top, goes back to 1972, when Black women were very much involved in fighting the sterilization abuse of women, and most women who got sterilized back, starting with the eugenics movement in the 1920s, were mothers. And what was interesting also about that photo that I found was that they were invoking the United Nations, talking about how it was an act of genocide to do this sterilization. And so I'll be talking about that more. And of course, the more that other sign down at the bottom left was from the Pink Pussy March I mentioned earlier. In 2010, a number of us Black women who were heading the reproductive justice movement had to fight this wave of anti-abortion billboards that were placed across the country. And so we coined the phrase Trust Black Women, that went from being a strategy to a hashtag and now a march sign by someone we've never even met. But that's the kind of resistance we've had historically, because we've always had to deal with the criminalization of Black women's bodies. During the enslavement, when having babies as Black women was profitable, it was demanded that we had babies. And as a matter of fact, physicians, always white, were brought to several plantations to try to figure out why some entire plantations weren't having babies, meaning Black women on these plantations. And it was discovered that Black women had brought over from Africa the same contraceptive knowledge, abortifacient knowledge that we used in Africa, we used here in the United States. And so there was always resistance by Black women to reproductive control. But then after the Civil War, all the fertility that had been encouraged for over 200 years was now seen as a problem. And again, Black women had to come up with our own strategies for resistance and reclamation of our bodies. And we did so through using, again, birth control, abortifacient, and abortions. And so the Black birth rate was cut in half between 1865 and 1910, according to a sociological study done by W.E.B. Du Bois. And that was 10 years before Margaret Sanger even started talking about and organizing on birth control. And of course, when she started her campaign, Black women rushed to her and asked her to establish clinics in the Black community because of the discrimination that we were experiencing when we tried to get services from the white clinics. And so despite what the anti-abortion movement tries to say, that somehow we're the dupes or the pawns of the reproductive health rights and justice movement, and that abortions are being forced upon us. In fact, we consider controlling our fertility as an essential act of self-determination, while we're fighting against these stereotypes of Black women as unnatural women or bad mothers, and the manipulation of our reproduction, either to make wealth for people or to be punished, because it's about not only the fact that our fertility is trying to be managed, but the children that we have as well. And you see the abuse of the child welfare and foster care system because of that. And then even when they write laws, we find that they're not applicable to us, that we can't use them. So George Zimmerman can kill Trayvon Martin by using the stand your ground law, but Marissa Alexander, who merely fired a shot up in the air to protect herself from an abusive husband for whom she'd got a protection order against, also in Florida, was sentenced to 20 years in prison because the Florida jury did accept a Black woman's use of the stand your ground law, even though she was protecting herself from a husband who was violating a court order and trying to batter her and her newborn child. And of course, one of the present things we're fighting is the urging of contraceptives. LARCs is long-acting reversible contraceptives, and Depo-Provera are the 3-month shots for fertility control that are targeting Black women, along with continuing sterilization abuse. I am in conversation and speaking on a program soon with Dawn Wooten, who was the nurse who became a whistleblower at the ICE detention centers in 2020. And of course, we're experiencing a lot of pregnancy policing. You're not doing the right behavior, or you won't submit to a cesarean if your doctor orders it, even if it may be unnecessary. And of course, we have our children experience a lot of discrimination. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of remedies through the legal system because the system is designed to ignore or minimize Black pain and suffering. And so I brought some more pictures to talk about embodied stories of reproductive oppression. The picture on the left was in the 1960s when President Lyndon Johnson was promising to build the Great Society. Black women marched and said, wait a moment, whose Great Society? As long as we still have Jim Crow segregation, we still had the war in Vietnam, sucking up all of our money anyway, and our sons and sometimes daughters were going off to die in these wars, while there was this big drive to deconstruct the social contract, because that was the beginning of neoliberalism as an economic theory. And then in the second picture, early Black women, particularly before Roe v. Wade, but also as part of the struggle of Roe v. Wade, which was 1973 Supreme Court decision to legalize abortion, were very much involved in the fight for abortion. As a matter of fact, before the legalization of abortion, Black doctors used to provide abortions in the Black community as a service for women, and they were lauded in the Black newspapers at times, like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and the Amsterdam News, and things like that, because they knew that these doctors were on the front lines of saving women's lives. But it wasn't until the white women started coming to the Black doctors to get the services that they weren't able to access from their white doctors that you saw the increased prosecution of Black doctors for providing abortion services, not because they were providing of the Black women, but because they were providing of the white women. And the third picture is an early picture of Dr. Dorothy Farabee, who was one of the first women in the Tennessee legislature when she got elected there to try to pass a bill in the 1960s to legalize abortion. And one of the organizations that was formed to fight sterilization abuse was called CARASA, the Committee Against Sterilization Abuse, which evolved into CARASA, the Committee for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse. So we have this long lineage of fighting for reproductive self-control, fighting for the right to bodily self-determination, and also being the most invisible embodiment of reproductive oppression. Bringing us more to a modern time, of course, we had a big march, started participating in the big marches, like the march you referenced earlier, Asha, the photo in the bottom left is from the Women of Color March, the delegation that I organized back in 2004 And at that time, it was the largest coalition or outpouring of support for abortion rights, but also for human rights ever taken place in this country. The march had 1.15 million people participate in it. And the phrase reproductive justice in the decade between when we had created it in 1994 and 2004, when this march took place, had become so mainstream that the pink sign that you see in the top left is actually by Planned Parenthood, where they were talking about reproductive justice for all. So reproductive justice became proof that an idea can move from the margins to the center of the debate. Sadly, the same way the ideas of the far right have moved into the center of the Republican Party. And again, Black women are always fighting for the right to control our reproduction. I think that is a picture of me in the middle, protesting the inclusion of abortion restrictions in the Affordable Care Act. And I think that was from 2009, while Obama was president. So it doesn't seem to matter whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in office, we still have to fight for bodily self-determination. So now that I've talked about reproductive justice, let me tell you what it is. It's a fairly simple concept to understand. It's based on the human rights framework, and it has three basic principles. Every woman has the human right to have a child. And we created that as our first principle because we have to fight all these continuing strategies of population control that have been imposed upon us since our arrival in this country, but particularly the strategies of sterilization abuse and the ideology of eugenics that we've had to fight. And that's a portion of our framework that is rarely mentioned in many ways by the pro-choice movement, because they're more preoccupied, shall I say, in protecting the second tenet, which is the right not to have a child by using birth control, abortion, or abstinence if you think you can hold on. And then the third tenet is neglected by both the pro-life and the pro-choice movement, and that's the human right to parent our children in safe and healthy environments. And so this is what we created in 1994 as the core of reproductive justice. But 20 years later, by 2014, our trans and LGBT people within the RJ movement, as we call it, wanted a fourth principle, talking about how individuals have the human right to disassociate sex from reproduction and promote healthy sexuality and pleasure as essential components to a whole and full human life. So they wanted a framework that focused on sexual pleasure, that focused on body autonomy without linking it to reproduction per se, and they wanted a more inclusive framework. A lot of people get confused because they think that there's some friction between reproductive health, which is a service delivery model, reproductive rights is a legal advocacy model, and reproductive justice is an organizing model. So I'll explain the relationship between the three. The reproductive health framework is an individual-based service delivery model, meaning people come to the doctor or they go to a healthcare provider or they go to the pharmacist and they get their reproductive health needs taken care of. While it focuses on the individual, it is less likely to focus on the superstructure in which that individual is embedded. They're too busy providing services to people to do the advocacy that you see happening in the reproductive rights movement. They're the ones that are synonymous with the phrase pro-choice, which is still a good phrase to use. So we're not dissing that phrase or discouraging people from using it. But that's the framework that talks about how do we keep access to reproductive health care, particularly abortion rights, the right to use birth control, to fight the child welfare system and its abuses, or protect the rights of people who are incarcerated, those kinds of things. That's where that work takes place under the constrictions of the US Constitution. And the reproductive justice framework we see as an organizing model that goes beyond the restrictions of the US Constitution to invoke the global human rights framework. And our job, as we see it, is to bring together all those three aspects of our same movement that are not in tension with each other, but are dimensions of the same kind of work. So from Black women, we always have to fight population control and eugenics directed towards us. And eugenics, I should stop to explain, is the false science that tries to say that humanity can be socially engineered the same way you would genetically engineer a flower or something like that. And it started in 1873, I believe it was, by Francis Galton, who was the cousin to Charles Darwin, who created this theory that it was possible using Darwin's principles of evolution to evolve a higher species of human being. And he was in England at the time, and this was a very convenient theory for the elites to believe in England, because there was a lot of unrest in British society at the time because of the rapid industrialization of their economy. And so instead of addressing the labor unrest that this rapid industrialization was creating, what they decided to do was say, well, these are just defective human beings, so it really doesn't matter if we do anything for them or not, because they're not capable of being the fully realized human beings we well-deserving elites are. And so the theory of eugenics that Galton created migrated to the United States just at the same time that we had the restriction on white women's reproduction started happening with the Comstock laws that forbid the transmission of any information around birth control and abortion through the mail, because Comstock was the Postmaster General of all things, Anthony Comstock. And so, because white women were receiving a lot of pressure to forcibly breed, to fulfill the mandate of manifest destiny, to totally replace the indigenous population of this country. So Native Americans were being instructed or directed or wiped out so that they could reproductively disappear, and they wanted to replace the indigenous population. And the previously enslaved population was white women. And so that's why not only was the Comstock laws passed, but the American Medical Association got on the bandwagon and supported the elimination of access to birth control and abortion information. As I said earlier, we have to always fight against the limits of the US Constitution, because it was created to really meet the needs of white slave owners. And it's been amended and amended, and we still got other amendments to go, because the Equal Rights Amendment is still not in the US Constitution. Women are not still in the US Constitution. And so we still got a lot of work to do within the US Constitution. But we also have to use intersectionality. Intersectionality is a statement of your vulnerabilities. What things are you vulnerable to that may cause you to experience a form of oppression? A lot of people mistakenly think of intersectionality as a statement of identity. No, it's a statement of vulnerability, because I'm not sure Scottish bagpipe players who have a particular identity are being particularly oppressed unless they're playing late at night in my backyard or something. Anyway, and so when we conceptualize reproductive justice, we always wanted it to offer a critique of white supremacy and neoliberal capitalism, that in its racialized version. And it isn't reproductive justice if you don't center the most marginalized voices in the lens, so that you understand who's the most needy and whose human rights are being most violated. Because one thing we say is that those who have the least in life need the most from human rights. And explaining the connections between reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, and particularly now in the 21st century, we've created another concept called reproductive futurism, which is looking to address the new challenges of the 21st centuries with the rapid technological changes around assisted reproductive technology and genetic modifications and things that are taking place. So Kamara Jones is the woman, the public health specialist at the Centers for Disease Control, and she was the first Black woman to become the president of the American Public Health Association. So she created a concept called the social determinants of health. And I like quoting her definition here for people who are unfamiliar with her work. Systemic racism manifests in the lives of Black people as reproductive oppression, which limits the choices of Black people in terms of when and how they can become pregnant, limits the care that they receive during and post-pregnancy, and can expose parents to institutional oppression. Exposure to systemic racism contributes to high rates of maternal and infant mortality and morbidity among Black people who can become pregnant in the United States. Public health scholars describe systemic racism as a pandemic in this country that is a public health crisis. And now, of course, Black people are living at the intersection of the COVID pandemic and the pre-existing public health pandemic. And one of the burdens that I'm currently bearing right now is in the 9 months, I've buried 2 of my sisters. We started out as 3 girls, and I'm the last remaining one alive. So this isn't just a theoretical experience, it's an existential one that we're all living through. And one of my favorite writers is Ricky Solinger, who talks about the myth of reproductive individualism. And this whole concept of individual choice is really holding us back, because in many ways it helps us because we've got a whole movement saying my laws, my bodies, my choice, individualizing it, but not recognizing that no one can make individual choices outside of the context in which they're embedded. And so we end up with this thing of reproductive individualism, like there's people who make good reproductive choices, usually they're middle class and upper class white people, they're told, and then people who make bad reproductive choices, like they're good choice makers versus the bad choice makers. And so we counter this reproductive individualism with reproductive justice. And of course, we're dealing with the resurgence of white nationalism and white supremacy in our body politics that's still having an impact on reproductive decision-making, with the bans on abortion and birth control, because I'm convinced that if the white supremacists could figure out a way to restrict abortions only to Black women and other women of color, they would send limousines to take us to the clinics. Again, just like in the early 1920s and 30s, a lot of the reproductive management and oppression we see is designed to control the fertility choices of white women, and we end up becoming roadkill in the process. So if you're going to use the concept of reproductive justice, we've established some core standards, because it is a criteria-based framework. It is not an identity-based framework. That's one of the big popular myths about it, is the myth that because it was created by Black women, it only applies to Black women, almost as if Black women can't create universal theory, which is kind of funny because a lot of people who make that claim already use Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, or they use the Combahee River Collective's concept of identity politics. But reproductive justice is one of those universal theories that it has some core values. First of all, it has to use intersectionality. Intersectionality is our process, while human rights are our goal. And you have to center vulnerable people in the lens. You also have to link global issues to local issues, because a lot of the privileges that happen here in the United States take place at the expense of people in what's called the global South. There's a real dialectical process between those two. And you just can't individualize reproductive oppression no more than you can individualize gender identity oppression. It's always tied to structures of inequality. And there's a lot of embedded racism, what they call implicit bias and stuff, in cultural assumptions that need to be made. And the purpose of our movement is to build power to end all forms of oppression. And if you use these standards, we can include everyone, because like I said, it's a criteria-based framework and not an identity-based framework. So we believe that sexual freedom and autonomy to determine one's sexuality and gender identity are key to reproductive justice for individuals in a community. If you don't fight population control and white supremacy, you're not doing reproductive justice work. And if you don't talk about deconstructing these drivers of reproductive oppression of white supremacy, neoliberal capitalism, and imperialism, you're not doing reproductive justice work. And because it's an organizing framework, we have to work with other social justice movements to build this new human rights framework. So that, for example, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, working with the civil rights wing of the human rights movement, working with the disability rights wing of the human rights movement, and the queer rights wing and environmental justice wing. You get the point. And I'm writing an article right now called Art is a Human Right that talks about how vital it is for us to understand the role of art and culture in our lives as a human right. So a person really can't decide what happens to their body without it being directly related to what's happening in their community, because we recognize that controlling people's body has been the main pathway to controlling entire communities through population control with eugenics logics. So the amount of human rights violations in a community will determine an individual's ability to be self-determining, and we offer new theories, new strategies, and new practices. So I'm going to stop the share there. I'm not sure how long our program goes, but I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A about what I've said so far.
Thank you so much, Professor Ross. We do have several questions for you. The first is from Pauline in New York, and is asking if you could share about the history of the term women of color.
Oh, absolutely. My knowledge of the term women of color came to me second-handed, but I do believe the people who told me the story, so I repeat it quite often. In 1975, there was the first World Conference for Women, and it took place in Mexico City, sponsored by the United Nations. In 1976, the United Nations decided to declare a World Decade for Women and mark that decade by having conferences every 5 years to celebrate women, but also to chart our growth towards justice and equality. Well, the United States in 1977, 2 years after the Mexico conference, decided to have a national conference for women. And President Jimmy Carter gifted to the women's movement $5 million to have this conference. And so everybody was really excited about coming to the first ever, government-funded National Women's Conference. Thousands of people enrolled and became delegates to it. And so one of the preparatory documents for this conference was called a National Plan of Action for Women. This had been put together by leaders of the major feminist organizations in advance of the 77 Houston meeting, because it was in Houston, Texas. And what they were hoping that the delegates to the conference would vote to ratify this plan, and it would become our action plan for achieving women's equality. But there were a group of Black women in Washington, D.C., who saw that in this 200-page action plan, only a couple of pages had been devoted to what they call minority women. And they were a little perturbed at that. They said, wait a moment, out of 200 pages, we get 2 kind of thing. And so they formed a group called the Black Women's Agenda. And so they wrote their own Black Women's Action Plan and took it to Houston to try to get a floor vote to get it substituted for the Minority Women's Action Plan. But once they got to Houston, they were surprised, but probably not too much so, that other minoritized women wanted to be included in the action plan. And they weren't objecting to that, but it was very Black focused because it had been written by Black women. So it was in those negotiations and the deliberations the night before the action plan was to be voted on that the term women of color was created, so that they could enfold in there Native American women, Latinas, Asian Pacific Islander women. But of course, once they agreed to include all these other minoritized women within that action plan, no longer could it be called the Black Women's Action Plan or the Black Women's Agenda. So they coined the term women of color in their negotiations. And at the time, they defined it not as an ethnic identity, because you're born African or African American, or you're born Latina or Mexican, or you're born, Samoan or Japanese. So it's not a statement of your ethnic identity, it's a statement of your intentionality about working in solidarity with other oppressed, minoritized women. So it's not, it's not an attempt to erase your ethnic identity, it's an attempt to describe your political solidarity. And so the next day, once they made that agreement to develop the term women of color, they renamed the agenda, offered it to Coretta Scott King, who read it from the stage, and it was almost unanimously approved, except by the Southern Mississippi kind of women who had also come to the conference, and they were opposed to anything that took place at that conference, even though they'd gotten themselves appointed as delegates and stuff. There was a whole anti-feminist, anti-ERA wing also at the conference at the time. And so that's where the term women of color came from the leadership of Black women trying to keep ourselves in the center of the lens and describing our reality, but also offering that agenda as a statement of solidarity to other minoritized women. And then that's where the term took off. And a lot of people mistakenly think that because they heard the term women of color, usually from white women, they think white women created it. And so they resist it, and they think that it's an imposition. And in fact, it was a very joyfully embraced term by those of us who understood what a political statement of solidarity it was. Now it's being replaced by BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, but it still contains the term people of color in it. So we're not mad at that. But the point is, a lot of people mistakenly think that it erases their own NATO identities, when in fact it's just offering a glimpse into what your political perspectives are about global solidarity.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question from Lily Clancy, and she is asking, can Professor Ross speak more about the ideas of reproductive futurism?
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'm in the process of writing a paper on that right now. Reproductive futurism applies Black feminist theory to this concept of techno-utopianism, because we believe that the scientists are over-promising this beautiful future of humanity with designer babies and babies that have these bad genes removed so that we can get rid of birth defects and all that kind of stuff. And we're saying, whoa, wait a minute. Because without any regulation and scrutiny by those of us who are most oppressed in our society, all of this technology is going to empower is an upgrading of the present oppression that we already experience. Because few of us can imagine that the desired designer baby is going to be Black or brown. And it is stratifying reproduction. And it's not so hard to envision, and I should add that I'm a chemistry and physics major, so I've got this left brain orientation anyway. But it's not so hard to imagine a Shulamith Firestone said in the 1970s that reproduction is going to take place ex utero pretty soon anyway, in uterine replicators and stuff like that. And so, how can we as Black feminists envision what how to use reproductive technology for the betterment of all humanity and not just the privileged few? And so we want to put some guideposts up there. We want to offer some warnings. We want to marry Afrofuturism with concepts of reproductive justice. We have a whole other concept talking about Africa being the birthplace of humanity and bringing together both African philosophies of Ubuntu along with some of the science that has been buried from Africa to talk about what reproductive futurism could look like through a Black feminist lens. But basically, we're saying, don't believe these marketers, don't believe these people, don't believe the hype, because even with this egg freezing and retrieval process, only 13% of those eggs result in successful pregnancies. So they're selling a whole lot of well-off people the promise of children that never materialize, just so that they can make a buck.
Got it. We have questions coming in from here in Chicago in the US and also from organizers in Poland. One of the questions is everyone working on behalf of reproductive justice globally. One of the questions is, why is women's sexuality demonized and feared across the world? It is clearly a source of anxiety to both men and women across the spectrum of society. This impacts reproductive justice. Thoughts on this?
Well, I think women's sexuality is feared and demonized across the globe because every empire needs bodies. They need bodies for their labor force. They need bodies for their military. They need bodies for their economies. They need bodies. And men have always expressed a patriarchal demand to control those bodies that they can make money off of and stuff. I mean, you're going back to Emperor Augustus in early Rome forbid Roman women from using birth control. And I'm like, wait a moment. They didn't even know how fetuses happen. They didn't even know how pregnancies happen, but they were making sure that women didn't use birth control. And the reason we know this, not because they kept any records of any women's voices back in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, but because they were studying why Roman fertility was going down so much. And many people misread the history and said, oh, it's because they had lead in their water and stuff like that. And those of us who do a more feminist read of Roman history discovered that they had learned techniques of fertility management like abortions and contraceptives because of the reach of the Roman Empire. And they had learned these techniques from Egypt. Because if you look at the Egyptian papyrus, there were actually prescriptions written in those papyrus about abortions and contraceptives that the Roman women were using. And we're talking about elite Roman women, because he wasn't restricting enslaved Romans about what they did, but it was elite Roman women. And so there's always been this desire by the patriarchy to control women's reproduction because they find it profitable to do so.
Thank you. And we have time for just one more question before 7 Chicago. This is from Lindsay in Austin. And really loved when you said that intersectionality is a process and human rights is our goal. Can you speak a bit more about that, please?
Well, a lot of people, once they discover the theory of intersectionality, they first misuse it and use it as a statement of identities. Kind of like, how many hats am I wearing? Well, I'm wearing this hat, and I'm wearing this hat, and I'm wearing this hat, and look how complicated I am. And I tend to say, well, welcome to the real world. I probably knew more about your identities before you decided to make them a cloak. But we all have very intersectional identities because we're able to live in many dimensions at the same time. I'm a senior citizen, Southern woman with disabilities, with grandchildren. I mean, how many identity, and I'm a college professor and a writer and a da-da-da. I mean, identities is not the issue. What are my vulnerabilities that intersectionality seeks to explain? And when Kimberly Crenshaw created the concept, she created it because the US legal system, she was serving as one of the attorneys for Anita Hill, who accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. And she was finding that the legal system was incapable of judging Anita Hill's case based on whether she was Black or whether she was a woman. She had to be one or the other. And so she used the concept of intersecting streets, you know, the street of sexism and the street of racism, and that Black women stood at the middle of that intersection. And we were vulnerable to cars coming down the race street or cars coming down the sex street. And so it is always a statement of vulnerability, but a lot of people think that once they get into their identity reclamation, that that's all the work they do. But like my mama used to say, now that you know you're Black, what you gonna do about it? Kind of thing. And so human rights should be our goal. And the way that you can think about it is that it's a human right for every child to have access to an education. But a blind child might need her books in Braille. So she doesn't have special human rights. She has special human needs. And so you use intersectionality to identify what those special human needs are so that she can get to the same human rights that the sighted children have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Ross. It's been amazing to have you with us for the past hour. Karen and Kristen, I believe, are coming back on just to thank you as well and to invite everyone to continue following your work as well as coming to MOCP to see the exhibition on reproductive justice.
Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you so much, Loretta. That was amazing. Thank you, Asha, for the great questions and introduction. And really, I learned a lot. You're so deeply knowledgeable. It was really inspiring, Loretta, to hear you talk tonight.
Thank you.
We encourage everyone watching to read your books if they haven't yet. There's so much scholarship out there that you do. And it's just, we can't believe that you said yes to our invitation. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you.
Can I just say, I have a website, lorettajross.com, if you want to stay in touch with me and keep up.
Thank you. And thanks for all of the work that you do.
All right. Thank y'all. You were my first presentation ever at a museum.
We're not the real
What a novelty for me.
If only we could actually be standing around art together right now, it'd be even better.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I like it when museums are not just U-Haul storage places. They actually want to make a difference in people's lives today. Those are the best museums, in my opinion. So thank y'all.
Thank you. We hope we can meet you in person soon, once this is over.
Honey, it ain't COVID I'm worried about. It's y'all's winters. I only come to Chicago in spring and summer. Bye-bye.